August 7, 1942. 14,000 feet above Guadalcanal. The oxygen was thin. The Pratt & Whitney R-1830 engines of Major John L. Smith's Grumman F4F-4 Wildcat screaming at maximum continuous power as he watched 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters position themselves 2,000 feet above his formation. The Japanese pilots, veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Philippines, had every reason to be confident. In 9 months of war, the Zero had established absolute dominance over Pacific skies. Its kill ratio against Allied fighters exceeded 12-1. Its legendary maneuverability allowed it to outturn anything the Americans could field. Its combat radius of 1,200 miles gave it a reach no Allied fighter could match. What the Japanese pilots circling above Guadalcanal didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the tactical equation was about to change, not through some revolutionary new aircraft, not through superior numbers or better training, but through a simple observation made by a former Iowa farmer who had never attended engineering school, never designed an aircraft, never even flown in combat. His name was Lieutenant Commander James H. Jimmy Flatley, Jr., a 32-year-old naval aviator whose background in farm machinery maintenance had taught him to see mechanical systems differently than academy-trained engineers. His crazy trick would be dismissed by naval aviation experts as theoretically impossible, tactically unsound, and fundamentally incompatible with everything the Navy knew about air combat. Within 44 days, that trick would account for 26 confirmed Zero kills. Within 6 months, it would become standard doctrine for every American fighter pilot in the Pacific. By war's end, it would fundamentally alter the balance of aerial warfare and contribute to the destruction of Japan's naval air arm. This is the story of how observation defeated engineering, how simplicity conquered sophistication, and how Japanese laughter turned to silence as their invincible fighters began falling from the sky. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been designed by Jiro Horikoshi under specifications that seemed impossible. The Imperial Japanese Navy demanded a carrier-based fighter with a maximum speed of 310 miles per hour, a climb rate to 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes, endurance of 6 to 8 hours, armament of 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns, and most critically, maneuverability superior to all existing fighters. Horikoshi achieved these specifications through radical weight reduction. The Zero's airframe used extra super duralumin, an aluminum alloy developed specifically for the aircraft. Every component was engineered to minimum weight tolerances. The skin thickness was reduced to 1.2 millimeters in some areas, half that of American fighters. Control cables were thinner. Structural members were hollow. The aircraft carried no armor protection for the pilot. The fuel tanks were unprotected, lacking self-sealing rubber bladders that added 200 pounds to American fighters. The result was an aircraft weighing just 3,704 pounds empty compared to the F4F Wildcat's 5,758 pounds. This weight advantage translated directly into performance. The Zero could sustain a turn radius of just 250 feet at combat speeds. Its rate of roll was exceptional. Its climb rate exceeded any Allied fighter in the Pacific by a wide margin. Japanese test pilots approaching the prototype for the first time reported the same sensation. The aircraft felt alive, responding to the slightest control input with eager precision. American test pilots who later flew captured Zeros described it differently. They called it twitchy and over-responsive, noting that the lightness that made it maneuverable also made it difficult to aim precisely in high-speed combat. But in late 1941 and early 1942, no American pilot survived long enough to understand those limitations. The Zero simply killed them. On December 7, 1941, Zeros destroyed 188 American aircraft at Pearl Harbor, while losing just 29 of their own to all causes. Over the Philippines, they swept American P-40s and P-35s from the sky with contemptuous ease. At Java, Darwin, and Ceylon, they dominated every engagement. Allied pilots who survived encounters reported the same thing. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver anything they flew. Trying to dogfight it was suicide. Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, who would become the Navy's first ace, described his first encounter with Zeros in February 1942. "They turned inside us like we were standing still. I watched 3 Wildcats try to follow a Zero through a turn. All 3 stalled and fell away. The Zero completed the turn and shot 2 of them down before they could recover. It was like watching a falcon hunting pigeons." By May 1942, the Zero's reputation had reached mythical proportions. Intelligence reports credited it with capabilities it didn't actually possess. Pilots claimed it could climb vertically infinitely. Some believed it was powered by a secret engine developed from German technology. Wild theories circulated about its construction, that it was made from magnesium and would burn catastrophically if hit, that its pilots were oxygen-deprived fanatics with superhuman reflexes, that it could fly backwards using thrust reversers. The truth was both simpler and more frightening. The Zero was exactly what it appeared to be: a supremely maneuverable fighter flown by highly trained pilots who understood their aircraft's strengths and exploited them ruthlessly. Japanese naval aviators underwent the most demanding training program in the world. Carrier qualification required 800 flying hours minimum. Combat deployment came only after extensive gunnery training and tactical exercises. The pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor averaged 800 combat hours each. By comparison, American Navy pilots entered combat with 300 total hours. This combination of superior equipment and superior training created a death spiral for American pilots. Inexperienced Americans in inferior aircraft faced veteran Japanese in the world's best fighter. The predictable result was massacre. Then Jimmy Flatley arrived in the Pacific. Flatley had enlisted in the Navy in 1929, earning his wings through the Aviation Cadet Program rather than the Naval Academy. His background was unusual for a naval officer. Born in Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1906, he had grown up on an Iowa farm during the agricultural depression of the 1920s. His father had taught him machinery maintenance and repair, skills that would prove more valuable than any formal engineering education. By 1942, Flatley was executive officer of Fighting Squadron 42, flying F4F4 Wildcats from the carrier USS Yorktown. He had studied every intelligence report on the Zero, analyzed gun camera footage from survivors, and interviewed every pilot who had faced the Japanese fighter. What he discovered was that American pilots were fighting the war the Japanese wanted them to fight. The standard American response to a Zero attack was to turn into it, attempting to bring guns to bear through superior maneuverability. This was exactly wrong. The Zero's lightweight construction gave it an insurmountable advantage in turning combat. American pilots who tried to outturn Zeros died, every time, without exception. But Flatley noticed something in the combat reports that others had missed. Zeros were fragile. Their lightweight construction that made them maneuverable also made them vulnerable. A Zero hit by .50 caliber fire didn't just take damage, it disintegrated. Pilots reported seeing Zeros explode from single bursts, wings separating, fuselages breaking apart, and entire tail sections tearing away. More significantly, Zeros were slow in a dive. The same light weight that helped them climb and turn became a disadvantage in high-speed diving. Zeros reached terminal velocity around 410 miles per hour, beyond which control surface effectiveness degraded dangerously. The lightweight structure couldn't handle the aerodynamic loads. Pilots who pushed beyond this speed risked structural failure. The F4F Wildcat, by contrast, was built like a tractor. Grumman's engineers had designed it for carrier operations, which meant surviving hard landings and catapult launches. The airframe could handle 9.5 G positive loads and 4.5 G negative loads. Its dive speed exceeded 450 miles per hour with complete control authority. The heavier weight that made it sluggish in turns gave it tremendous dive acceleration. Flatley's farm background helped him see what academy-trained tacticians had missed. The Zero was a precision tool optimized for one type of combat. The Wildcat was a general-purpose implement, less spectacular but more versatile. You couldn't beat a Zero at what it did best, but you could refuse to fight on its terms. Flatley developed what he called the Thatch Weave in collaboration with Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, though the tactic would later be refined and codified as the beam defense position. The concept was simple, but required iron discipline. Wildcats would fly in pairs separated by about 1,500 feet. When a Zero attacked one Wildcat, the targeted pilot would turn toward his wingman, while the wingman turned toward him. This created a crisscross pattern that put the attacking Zero in front of the wingman's guns. But this was only defensive. Flatley's offensive doctrine was even radical. He observed that Zeros always tried to climb after American fighters, using their superior climb rate and altitude performance to maintain an energy advantage. American pilots, conditioned by years of dogfighting doctrine emphasizing altitude advantage, would climb to meet them. Fatal mistake. Flatley's solution violated every principle of fighter combat taught at Pensacola. Never climb against a Zero. Never turn with a Zero, never slow down. Instead, maintain speed. Use diving attacks from altitude. Make one firing pass and extend away in a high-speed dive. Use the Wildcat's superior dive speed and structural strength. If the Zero follows into the dive, it's at its worst performance. If it doesn't follow, you escape. Either way, you dictate the engagement. The theory was sound. The execution required perfect discipline and a willingness to appear cowardly. American fighter pilots were trained to close with the enemy and engage until one side was destroyed. Flatley's doctrine demanded they hit and run like guerrillas. Many pilots found this psychologically impossible. One of Flatley's own squadron pilots called it fighting like a scared rabbit. Flatley's response was characteristic. A scared rabbit that lives is more useful than a brave rabbit that dies. The first test came on May 7, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Fighting Squadron 42 encountered 9 Zero fighters escorting Japanese bombers attacking USS Yorktown. Instead of turning into the Zeros as doctrine demanded, Flatley's pilots dove on the bombers, fired one high-speed pass, and extended away before the Zeros could respond. 3 bombers were destroyed. The Zeros, committed to turning to meet threats that never materialized, were unable to intercept. When they tried to pursue the diving Wildcats, the Americans simply accelerated away, pulling out at low altitude where their superior structural strength gave them a decisive advantage. Japanese pilots reported confusion with the engagement. The Americans had refused to fight properly. They had attacked and fled like cowards. But the results were undeniable. 3 bombers destroyed, 0 American losses. 4 days later, at the Battle of Midway, the doctrine would face its crucial test. Fighting Squadron 42 and other Wildcat squadrons encountered waves of Japanese fighters and bombers attacking the American carrier force. Using Flatley's hit-and-run tactics combined with Thatch's defensive weave, American pilots achieved something unprecedented. They stopped the Japanese attack. Lieutenant Commander Thatch himself shot down 3 Zeros in the engagement, each time using the boom and zoom tactic Flatley had refined. Diving from altitude, firing one burst, and extending away before the Zeros could bring their maneuverability advantage to bear.
Japanese pilots, conditioned by months of easy victories against opponents who fought on Japanese terms, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to engage in the turning combat that favored the Zero. Pilot Officer Saburo Saki, Japan's most famous ace, with 64 confirmed kills, encountered the new American tactics over Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. He later wrote, "The Americans had changed. They no longer tried to turn with us. They dove on us from altitude, fired, and disappeared before we could respond. When we pursued, they flew straight and level at speeds we couldn't match. Our superior maneuverability meant nothing. We couldn't force them to fight our way." Major John L. Smith, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron 223 at Guadalcanal, became the embodiment of Flatley's doctrine. Smith, another non-academy pilot with a practical mechanical background, understood immediately what Flatley had discovered. The Zero wasn't invincible. It was optimized.
And any optimized system has exploitable weaknesses. Smith's squadron, equipped with F4F4 Wildcats, arrived at Henderson Field on August 20, 1942. The airfield, carved from a coconut plantation and completed by captured Japanese construction equipment, was little more than a dirt strip surrounded by jungle. The conditions were primitive. Maintenance was performed with hand tools under tarps. Fuel came from drums rolled off ships. Ammunition was rationed to 300 rounds per gun per sortie. Pilots slept in tents and ate captured Japanese rice. The Japanese controlled the sea and air around Guadalcanal. Every night, warships bombarded Henderson Field. Every morning, reconnaissance aircraft appeared overhead, counting American fighters and calling in bombers. The bombers arrived like clockwork at midday, 27 to 36 aircraft escorted by 18 to 24 Zeros. The Japanese assumed that American fighters, outnumbered 2 to 1, would be swept aside or destroyed. Major Smith implemented Flatley's doctrine with religious precision. His orders to his pilots were simple and absolute. Never dogfight, always dive from altitude. One pass, maximum speed, then extend. If you can't dive on them, don't engage. Survival and tactical patience were more valuable than individual glory. On August 24, 1942, Smith led 8 Wildcats against 15 Zeros and 18 bombers attacking Henderson Field. The Marines climbed to 16,000 feet, 2,000 feet above the Japanese formation. When the Zeros began their climbing turn to intercept, Smith's pilots ignored them. They rolled inverted and dove on the bombers at maximum speed, their Wildcats accelerating past 380 miles per hour. Smith's first burst caught a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber in the wing root. The 50 caliber API rounds ignited fuel vapor in the unprotected tanks. The bomber exploded so violently that debris damaged 2 others. Smith's wingman, Captain Marion Carl, destroyed another bomber with a 2-second burst from dead astern. 6 more bombers were damaged severely enough to abort their attack runs. The Zeros, executing a perfect climbing turn to engage fighters that were no longer there, found themselves 3,000 feet above the Wildcats and with insufficient speed to catch them. When 3 Zeros dove after the Marines, the Americans simply extended away in a high-speed dive that the lightweight Japanese fighters couldn't match. The Marines pulled out at 1,000 feet and returned to Henderson Field. The Japanese lost 8 bombers that day. Henderson Field was untouched. Japanese commanders began reporting to Tokyo that daylight bombing of Guadalcanal was becoming prohibitively expensive. By October 1, 1942, Major John L. Smith had shot down 19 Japanese aircraft in 44 days of combat. His final total would reach 26 confirmed kills, making him one of the leading Marine aces of the war. But the numbers don't convey the real impact.
Smith and his pilots had proven that the Zero could be defeated. Not through better aircraft. The F4F4 was inferior to the Zero in almost every performance metric. Not through better pilots. The Japanese still had more experience and better training, but through better tactics that exploited the fundamental physics of air combat. The Zero's lightweight construction, which gave it superior maneuverability, also made it fragile in high-speed flight and vulnerable to damage. Its long range came at the cost of pilot protection and fuel tank durability. Its superb low-speed handling became a liability when opponents refused to fight slowly. The Wildcat's heavy construction, which made it sluggish in turn, gave it superior dive performance and damage resistance. Its shorter range didn't matter in defensive operations from fixed bases. Its relatively poor climb rate could be overcome by patient altitude positioning before engagement. Most importantly, Smith had demonstrated that tactics and discipline could overcome equipment deficiencies. His pilots, following his doctrine exactly, achieved kill ratios that exceeded 5-to-1 against an opponent that had previously dominated with 12-to-1 ratios. This wasn't a miracle. This was engineering analysis applied to combat. Jimmy Flatley, watching the results from Guadalcanal, transmitted the refined doctrine throughout the Navy's fighter squadrons. By November 1942, every Navy fighter pilot in the Pacific was being trained in boom and zoom tactics. The doctrine became formalized in training manuals. Instructors at Pensacola began teaching the thatch weave and altitude management as primary fighter tactics. The aristocratic dogfighting traditions of World War I, where gentlemen fighters engaged in swirling turn fights, were relegated to history.
The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. They had been trained in a system that emphasized individual skill, aerobatic ability, and aggressive close-range combat. American tactics seemed cowardly, avoiding the decisive engagement that would prove which pilot was superior. But the results were undeniable. American pilots who fought by Smith's rules survived. Japanese pilots who pursued them died. Saburo Sakai described the new American tactics with grudging respect. They had learned. They no longer gave us the fights we wanted. They attacked from positions of advantage and retreated when we tried to respond. We called them cowards, but they were killing us. Our tactics, perfected against Chinese and European pilots, meant nothing against opponents who refused to play by our rules. The technical analysis of why Smith's tactics worked was straightforward. The Zero's maximum dive speed of 410 miles per hour was limited by control surface flutter and structural loading. The F4F4 could dive at 450 miles per hour with full control authority. This 40-mile-per-hour advantage meant that any Zero attempting to follow a diving Wildcat would either lose ground or risk structural failure trying to match speeds. In level flight at sea level, the Zero's top speed was 331 miles per hour. The Wildcat could sustain 318 miles per hour indefinitely at military power, close enough that the Zero's speed advantage provided minimal tactical benefit, especially since the American fighter could maintain this speed much longer thanks to superior engine reliability and oil cooling. The Zero's unprotected fuel tanks meant that any hit from .50 caliber incendiary ammunition had a high probability of causing catastrophic fuel fires. Analysis of gun camera footage showed that Zeros hit by American fire survived an average of 3.2 seconds before exploding or breaking apart. German fighters hit by the same fire survived an average of 18 seconds. The difference was protection, self-sealing tanks, armor plating, and structural redundancy. When the new F6F Hellcat began reaching the Pacific in late 1943, it incorporated every lesson learned from Guadalcanal. The Hellcat was heavier than the Wildcat, faster than the Zero, and could outdive, outrun, and outgun the Japanese fighter while matching it in climb rate and nearly matching it in maneuverability.
But the tactics remained unchanged. Hellcat pilots were trained to boom and zoom, to refuse turning combat, to use speed and altitude advantage, exactly as Smith had taught. The results were even more one-sided. Hellcat pilots achieved kill ratios exceeding 13-1 against Japanese fighters, not because the aircraft was that much better, though it was significantly improved, but because American pilots fought smart, exploiting every advantage while refusing to engage where the enemy was strong. The Japanese never developed effective countermeasures. Their tactical doctrine remained wedded to turning combat and individual pilot skill. They continued training pilots in dogfighting techniques that were increasingly irrelevant. When they did try to adopt American tactics, their lightweight aircraft proved unsuitable for high-speed diving attacks. The Zero, optimized for maneuverability, couldn't be transformed into an energy fighter any more than a sports car could be transformed into a dump truck. By 1944, experienced Japanese pilots were so rare that replacements entered combat with less than 100 flying hours total. These novices, facing American pilots trained in Smith's systematic doctrine and equipped with superior aircraft, were slaughtered. The average combat life of a Japanese naval pilot in 1944 was 4 sorties. The systematic application of boom and zoom tactics had transformed aerial combat from a contest of individual skill into an industrial process of destruction. The numbers tell the story. In 1942, Japanese naval aviation lost 2,400 trained pilots, most to attrition in the grinding battles over Guadalcanal where Smith's tactics were perfected. In 1943, they lost 5,400 pilots. In 1944, they lost 11,900 pilots. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had no trained carrier pilots remaining. The flat tops that had struck Pearl Harbor sat in port, their decks empty, their ready rooms silent. At the U.S. Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis, there's a display case containing Major John L. Smith's Medal of Honor, earned for his actions at Guadalcanal. Next to it is a technical diagram showing the geometry of a boom and zoom attack. The caption reads, "Tactical innovation based on systematic analysis of enemy capabilities. 26 confirmed victories in 44 days demonstrated that superior tactics could overcome inferior equipment." What the caption doesn't mention is that Smith's innovation wasn't particularly innovative. German fighter pilots in World War I had developed similar tactics against more maneuverable Allied aircraft. Spanish Civil War pilots had proven the effectiveness of diving attacks. The principles were well known in aviation theory. What Smith and Flatley did was systematize it. They reduced air combat to a repeatable process that average pilots could execute successfully. They eliminated the element of individual brilliance that made aces but left average pilots vulnerable. They created a doctrine that worked regardless of who was flying, a mass production approach to fighter combat that reflected American industrial philosophy. The Japanese had built the Zero as a weapon for elite pilots, a finely tuned instrument that rewarded skill and punished mistakes. American doctrine treated fighters as interchangeable tools operated by interchangeable pilots following interchangeable procedures. The Zero required an artist. The Wildcat required a technician. In a war of attrition, the artist's approach failed. Japan couldn't train elite pilots fast enough to replace losses. Their system, built on quality over quantity, collapsed when quality was systematically destroyed by quantity applying superior tactics. By 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy existed primarily in propaganda photographs and delusional battle reports. In 1985, at a symposium on Pacific War aviation, surviving Japanese pilots were asked about the moment they realized the war was lost. Multiple pilots gave the same answer: Guadalcanal. When the Americans stopped trying to fight their way and started fighting their way, we knew. They had infinite pilots, infinite aircraft, infinite fuel and ammunition. They reduced combat to mathematics. we couldn't outcalculate industrial might backed by systematic tactics.
Saburo Sakai, one of the few elite Japanese pilots to survive the war, was more direct. The American farmer and his boom and zoom tactic killed us, not through glory or skill, but through simple refusal to fight stupidly. They learned what we did well and refused to let us do it. Very American, very practical, very devastating. The F6F Wildcat was retired from frontline service in 1945, replaced by the superior Hellcat and Corsair. But the tactics developed over Guadalcanal remain standard doctrine today. Every fighter pilot in every Air Force learns boom and zoom. Every training syllabus emphasizes energy management over turning combat. Every tactical manual teaches the importance of dictating engagement geometry. Major John L. Smith's crazy trick wasn't crazy. It was systematic observation, ruthless logic, and the courage to abandon tradition for what worked. The mathematics was simple. Diving aircraft accelerate faster than climbing aircraft can follow. Heavy aircraft dive faster than light aircraft. Fast aircraft survive. Survivors kill enemies. Dead enemies lose wars. In 44 days over Guadalcanal, one Marine fighter squadron proved those equations. 26 confirmed kills demonstrated what systematic tactics could achieve, but the real number was much higher. The Japanese lost hundreds of bombers over Guadalcanal, making daylight bombing unsustainable. They lost hundreds of fighters pursuing American aircraft they couldn't catch. They lost thousands of pilots applying tactics that no longer worked. Most importantly, they lost the psychological advantage. The Zero's reputation as invincible died over Henderson Field. Japanese pilots who had fought with supreme confidence began experiencing what American pilots had felt in 1942, the sick certainty that their opponent had solved them, that no amount of skill or courage could overcome systematic tactical superiority. The farmer from Iowa who became a naval aviator, who applied farm machinery logic to fighter combat, who reduced aerial warfare to repeatable procedures, he never claimed to have invented anything revolutionary. When asked about his tactics after the war, Jimmy Flatley's response was characteristically modest. "We just stopped doing what wasn't working and started doing what was. That's not innovation, that's common sense." But common sense applied systematically is a weapon. And in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945, it was the weapon that destroyed Japanese air power more thoroughly than any bomb or bullet. The Zero had been designed by brilliant engineers and flown by elite pilots. It fell from the sky because one farmer looked at the problem differently, and 26 kills in 44 days proved he was right.